My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Ron Hayes from Oregon Wine Brotherhood. It's July 17th, 2017. We're here in the Nicholson Library. And Ron, before we start talking about the Brotherhood, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your career?
I'm a lifetime insurance broker. I do property casualty insurance. I have done all my life. I started in Portland a long time ago. I was transferred, worked with a major company, transferred to Southern California to manage an office, back to Portland to manage an office, and to San Francisco to manage the 11 western states for them. And didn't want to go to Boston, so I moved back to Portland. Well, actually, I'm a Clackamaniac, so in Clackamas County. And that sort of goes along with the wine side. In the early 70s, my wife and I started collecting wines, and I thought, within a couple of years I'd be ready to drink. And suddenly, she gave me a home winemaking kit, so I could feed my home wine to my friends, not the wines in the collection. So then I was transferred to San Francisco. I had an office in the city. I lived in Orinda. And just east of that was Contra Costa Junior College, and they were having a night class in winemaking. Joined the class, and they were, it turns out that I knew about as much as the instructor. We all became friends, and it became a home winemaking co-op. So we bought tons and tons of grapes as a group and made our own wine. And as I said, I didn't want to go to Boston, so I changed jobs, came back to Portland with the whole idea of starting a winery, or starting a vineyard. Mm-hmm. And that was in November 76. We had the movers left me behind and my wife behind with a U-Haul truck with wine fermenting in 15-gallon barrels in the back. So we drove to Portland, put that in a storage unit, mm-hmm. And went down in January and picked up grape cuttings from Winty, several hundred of them, and put our first vines in the ground in the spring of -- mm-hmm. And we had our first crop in 1980. So back in 76, we heard about a meeting of the Oregon. It wasn't the Wine Growers Association, it was a predecessor to that. They were having a meeting in Portland State, and Dr. Ann Noble was giving a presentation on sensory evaluation of wine. And we went down. It was a good chance to meet some people. And from that, we joined the Portland Wine Tasters Guild. Mm. And from that, we met everybody. And we met people like the Ponzis and the ERS and the Campbells and particularly John and Sally Bowers. Dr. John Bowers and his wife Sally and my wife Judith and I became best friends. And we tried a lot of wines. We did blind. It was a lot of fun in those days. In the early spring of 1980, John and Sally were on some kind of a medical convention, and they met a guy in Southern California who was a member of the Brotherhood of the Knights of the Vine. And this was one of the chapters, and they flew down to Beverly Hills and joined the Beverly Hills chapter. Came back and said, "You got to join this. We got to start a chapter up here." Mm. Okay, so we did. I went down with the Bowers in the middle of the summer of 1980, and I joined that was the Chancellery chapter, the home office for the Wine Brotherhood in the United States, and I joined at Mondavi Winery, mm-hmm. and I was on my knees next to Bob Mondavi when he was knighted. So we came back and decided that we were going to start a chapter here. And the next, we had a couple of three planning events. And then the spring of 1981, we had our first assemblage. Oregon chapter, Brotherhood of the Knights of the Vine, and there were 3 members who went into this, plus a lot of help from my wife. So John Bowers was the commander, I was the vice commander, and Sally became the master scribe, and then we had to coerce our friends into it. This started up here as a circle of friends, and grew into a larger circle of friends, and a larger circle of friends, and a larger circle of friends. And we felt that the purpose was to get people together with like interests and like mind. We're all friends. There were some industry people, there were some wholesalers, some retail, some vineyard owners, some winery owners, and people who retired, some young folks. We had a whole variety of people in the group. The first assemblage was at the Benson, and then the next year we went down to Salishan, and for a number of years, we alternated between the two. In 1991, John retired. Sally was having some health problems, and he became a master commander emeritus, and I took over as the commander, and held that for a few years. Back in those days, the Winehood was a benevolent dictatorship. We tried to be benevolent anyway. And I passed the torch along to Paul Hart. And we, at that point, we were one of the biggest and the strongest chapters. We didn't see any reason that we should belong to the Brotherhood of the Knights of the Vine anymore. So the 3 of us, the 3 commanders and our spouses, went down to San Francisco to the big annual, had a big meeting. We said, we don't like how things are going. We are going to break off and join the master organization in France. We did, and that became the Oregon Wine Brotherhood. And from there, you can probably, I can tell you more, but you can probably get the story for that organization from the next 3 commanders that you'll be talking to. So let me go back and start now with grapes. If you pick grapes, pick a few handful of grapes and put them in a mayonnaise jar, squish them a little bit and set them on the shelf. In 2 days you have wine. In 2 weeks you have vinegar. In 2 months you have fingernail polish remover. So what wine is, it's the controlled decomposition of grapes. So you want to, Now, in the early days they didn't have mayonnaise jars, so they used crockery jugs, they used sheep stomachs and whatever. And wine wasn't really good. So they started putting flavorings in the wine, which is a long, slippery slope because some of the flavorings became poisonous. And if you read your Roman history, a lot of Roman aristocracy died from poisoned wine. Okay. Well, in France, they had the just like everywhere else, they had the royal tasters for the food, and they had the royal tasters for the wine. Except they were poisoning the wine all the way down in the vineyard. So, oddly enough, the French Revolution came, and all these gallant guys running around with their swords in hand, rescuing maidens, didn't have anything to do because there was no aristocracy anymore. So, looking for something to do, they became the guards for the wine chain, and they transferred their allegiance into the local wine growing region, and they became the enthusiast for the region, the Chamber of Commerce, if you will. So every wine growing village in France has a chapter or a group like this, and most of them in Italy, some in Germany, and so forth. and they had a central organization in Paris. And I'm going to skip around a little bit because there was a gentleman in World War II named Norman Gates, and he was stationed in North Africa, which was mostly French where he was. And then after North Africa, Norman was stationed in Paris. And he met two things French that he liked, people a lot. One was his wife, Nicole, and the other was wine. So he married Nicole. They went back to Grass Valley, California. And in 1991, he received the charter from the International for Wine Brotherhoods in North and South America. Okay. And when we joined, we were the 17th of such chapters, the Oregon chapter. By the way, he had one in England too, but he couldn't call it. They couldn't be called Knights. That was called the Zinfandel Club. You may have heard that story. Had one in Japan. So anyway, the purpose of our group, I feel, is the camaraderie, the common interest, and the support of the local Oregon wine industry. And we've always done that. As a matter of fact, Mahonia Hall, when Neil Goldschmidt was governor, put in a wine cellar. Really? The Oregon Winery Association put wine in it, but we built the cellar, including the racks and so forth, and air conditioning system. As a matter of fact, we have photographs of the cadre of the Brotherhood on the back deck of Mahonia Hall with Neil while his wife was fixing hors d'oeuvres for us upstairs.
What do you find special about the Oregon wine industry itself?
Oh, gee. There are too many things that are special. I think that we've gotten the attention of the entire world. The best Pinot Noir anywhere in the world is now grown in Oregon, and that wasn't always the case. I remember when we would go out and taste the wine, and we'd say, "Boy, that's sure not as bad as it was last year." But that was, that was in the late 70s. It's come a long ways. It's been a learning experience. When we planted our vineyard, we planted about 30 different varieties of grape or clones, and that it was experimental. We sold grapes to home winemakers mostly, but we sold cuttings to a number of the wineries, including Montanore and St. Joseph's and Christopher Bridge. Matter of fact, Christopher Bridge is my next door neighbor. They used to come over. He and his brother-in-law, who owns a winery up on Vashon Island, they used to come over every time brother-in-law came down and taste all my homemade wines. So anyway, other questions? I'm probably talking more than you wanted to hear.
No, this is no, we'll never say that. When you started the Oregon Wine Brotherhood, and then more specifically when you sort of changed organizations midstream, mm-hmm. What was it about the mission? What was your mission? What was the goal of the Brotherhood?
You mean when we made the change?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We were sending a whole lot of money to the chapter, and all we were getting back is a magazine and some business card and some a newsletter. So and a little card that said we're members. And we did not like some of the things they were doing. They were going commercial in many ways, mm-hmm. and we didn't feel this was commercial. This is to support the wine industry, not support any of the members.
And so the focus, now you have a kind of a more recent focus on education. So where did that come about?
Well, we've always had that.
Okay.
Yes. The events when we started with what we call the barrel tasting in the fall, and that's where we introduced new members into the prospective members and to meet the brothers and sisters, and the knights and knighties, as they say. And the idea was to taste the wine from the barrel that had not been released yet. So we literally, the wineries brought their wine sometimes in barrels, sometimes in bottles, without labels, and everybody got to taste them. So that was the purpose of the barrel tasting, and it's still the main purpose of the barrel tasting. And then we, the next function was in January, and it was called the Commander's Coffee, where coffee wasn't served. It was a champagne tasting, where we actually indoctrinated the inductees coming into the group as to what the group was all about and so forth. And then we have our grand assemblage in the middle of the spring, and that's a 2.5 day event, black tie, a Saturday night, at night. We've had it at the Allison several years now. And then we had late summer, early fall, we had an educational tasting. It was a 1-day event. So we've always had that. And we started giving money away as scholarships almost right away. We supported the Culinary Institute. We used to give 4 or 5 or 6 scholarships every year to students who were involved in food and wine together. And then we've progressed from there to many other things too. We supported Barney Watson back when he was at Oregon State experimenting. There have been experiments in different types of oak, different clones. We've supported all of that. And right now we give a lot of money away to students studying wine and grapes.
Excellent. So Linfield's got a pretty new wine studies program. I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but I'm curious your thoughts on kind of a new way of looking at wine education.
Well, I've taught some classes in wine.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, I as a guest, I taught in Schmitt some, and at Clackamas Community College some. I was a guest speaker a long time ago on growing grapes, making wine, and tasting wine. So.
Excellent.
And the Brotherhood also has, they have excursions. They've had excursions into California from here, and into Eastern Washington from here, just to learn more about, or teach people and learn more about the grapes of those areas.
So what are the accomplishments of the Brotherhood that you're most proud of, or we look back fondly on?
Survival for how many years since 1981? It's a well-respected group. We have dedicated workers in there. When we first started, there were mostly 4 workers. It was John and Sally and my wife Judith and I, and that's grown to where there are a lot of people doing a lot of jobs now, which makes it a lot easier. Next question, I guess.
What do you hope to see it accomplished in the future?
Well, I'm retired.
So whatever it does.
Yes. I have one of the only jobs in the organization from which I can't be fired. I'm a commander emeritus. So I will always be emeritus. That's another word. That's another word for has been. So I stay involved to some extent. I go to business meetings. I go to the Commander's Coffee. I sometimes make presentations at other places. So,
do you have any hopes for what will happen next?
Oh, it's just going to keep getting better. I think that the soil is burned out in France. I think that when they came over, even back when I was involved in the first Pinot Noir Festival, and we had people over from France. They couldn't believe how much acid we had in our grapes. They don't have any anymore. They have to add acid. Or at that time they did. So even back then they were looking at, when we moved back from San Francisco in '76, there were about 35 wineries in Oregon. And you have better statistics than I do now, but there are probably 35 new ones every year. There's something like 600 to 700 now.
Yeah, a little over 700 now.
Yeah.
1,000 vineyards.
Oh, you're behind.
So you talk about IPNC. Tell us a little bit about your involvement with the beginnings of IPNC.
Oh, nothing. We were just volunteers.
Volunteers?
And I was here for going to the sessions.
What was it like?
It was exciting to have people coming from all over the world to taste Oregon wines and liking them. Some of them were surprised, especially the French.
I hear that a lot, yeah.
Yes. I particularly enjoy the blind tastings where, no, that couldn't be. That wine couldn't be from the United States. It couldn't be from Oregon. It's not good. It's too good. And it is.
So you've seen pretty much been here for the whole modern industry, more or less.
When our friends, when we moved back, were the Eras and the Campbells and Myron Redford and his mother and his brother and Joe and Pat Campbell. These are the people that we ran around with and tasted wine with. I remember when the Ponzis built their winery. Before that, they were made it in their basement. We were sitting on their lawn one Sunday afternoon, and a couple of guys came up and said, "I think we're going to start a brewery." It was the McMenamins. So
what's? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to tell a little aside. We were having a party at our place in the late 70s, sometime early 80s, and the Ponzis were there and a few other people, and we were looking for something unique to do. So another friend of my mother-in-law's was Fred Eckert. Fred Eckert he's deceased, but he was sort of the grand old man of the Oregon beer business. He was there at the start. Anyway, Fred says, "Well, let's have a beer tasting." I said, "Beer's beer." He said, "Oh no!" He gave me a list of 6 beers. He says, "You bring these 6, I'll bring these 6, and we'll have a beer tasting." And we did. And a few years later, we were invited down to Salishan for the 25th anniversary or whatever, and they invited a number of people. And in their large room, they had alternating restaurants and wineries all the way around the room. And over in the corner is Bridgeport Brewery. Bridgeport. So I went over and I said, "Dick Ponzi, what are you doing making beer?" And he says, "It's your fault." I said, "Well, my fault?" He says, "Yes, before you had your beer tasting, I thought beer was beer." So, I guess I had something to do with the beer business too.
And just another successful Ponzi enterprise there.
Yes.
So
Dick Ponzi, his job, his career, he was an engineer, mechanical engineer, and he designed rides at Disneyland before he came to Oregon.
One of my favorite stories about the industry, having an Imagineer up here making wine.
Yes.
So what surprised you the most about what you've seen change in the industry, and since you've pretty much seen it grow up to what it is now?
I never thought there would be this kind of growth. And it doesn't appear to be stopping. I was pleasantly surprised when the French started buying vineyards up here, and that's continuing, and I think that will continue. It's not just the Californians buying grapes up here, but the French. What I hope it doesn't do, the direction I hope it does not go, is to have giant factories. I think that this is a boutique business, and ought to remain that way.
Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
That's all the answers I have for you.
Any questions for you? Okay. Well, then thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
I am with Diane Diamond with the Oregon Wine Brotherhood. It is July 17th, 2017, and we are in the Nicholson Library. And so before we start into the Brotherhood, can you just tell us a little bit about your own background and career?
I'm a retired CPA, so I spent a few years in public accounting and then in private accounting, and that led me to a job as the Chief Operating Officer and the Chief Financial Officer for a company where I worked with Paul Hart, who is one of the original members of the Oregon Wine Brotherhood. And so and I also knew Ron Hayes through the company that I worked for. So both Ron and Paul I believe you're talking to, and they were so instrumental in the Wine Brotherhood, and both of them had told me about it for many, many years. And then in 1996, I believe it was, they finally convinced me to join the Wine Brotherhood, and I think it was a little bit of a mission because the Oregon Wine Brotherhood hosted the international event here in Portland in 2001. And of course they needed an accountant. So I think that's part of what got me into it. But I'd been interested for a long time in the Wine Brotherhood, just because it sounded like a really great organization of people, but also a way to learn more about wine in our area. And I'd been interested in that for a long time. So that was kind of that whole package that got me involved in the first place. And then after the international event in 2001, by then I was the treasurer, so then I was on the cadre of officers, and as time went on I moved from there into being the vice commander, and then I was the commander for 4 years, and I think that was 2004 to 2008, something like that. So that was fun. I just kept getting more and more involved.
So can you talk a little bit about how you first developed an interest into wine? Was it through Paul Hart and that connection?
A little bit, yeah. It was through business and dinners and trying to order wine in restaurants and things like that. So I was always curious as to, well, how do you know which wines to choose, and how do you know about particular wines? So Paul Hart suggested that I go and take a wine class at a little shop in Portland that doesn't exist anymore. A lot of people started there. It was Harris Wine Cellars. And so there'd be classes about different types of wine, Bordeaux's and Oregon Pinots, or just wines from all over the world. They had a lot of different classes. So it was really interesting to start learning a little bit more about wine. And then as I started learning more about it, I got to really love it. And then, of course, eventually that got me interested in the Wine Brotherhood. So I think I got interested in wine the way a lot of people do. They are served wine somewhere, or they're involved in some activity where wine is served, and they wonder, okay, how does anyone know anything about this? Because on the surface it can sound kind of complicated, but then as you get education, it's not quite as complicated, although there's so many things out there that it's a constant learning experience and constant journey.
Yeah. So what do you think is special about the Oregon wine industry in particular?
Well, I think it's great that we live in a region where we've seen the industry grow. It's kind of like Napa was in the early stages, where there were a few people that had the vision or the courage or something that drove them to try making wine in that particular region. And so the Oregon wine industry isn't that old, but has grown so rapidly and so beautifully. And we're so fortunate to still have some of the original people here that can tell us their stories and tell us what it was like in the early days when they were just out there being farmers and doing all the work themselves and making wine in their garages. There's a lot of those stories, and look what it is today. It's just had such an impact on wine all over the world that it's really delightful. And I still find that some of the most fun in the Oregon wine country is going to the really small wineries and meeting the owners that are still so active. They're not a big corporation. They're just a little farm, because it's really farming in the end. That's what it is, and it has the ups and downs of any farming season, the weather and everything. So it lends the character and the interest to the story.
So can you talk a little bit about being vice commander and then commander for the Oregon Wine Brotherhood?
Well, I never wanted to be commander. I was happy to just do what I was good at, the numbers side of it. And so I don't know exactly how it was that I became commander. I guess I was the best choice at that time or something. But I found that as I did it, I really, really liked it, because in that position you get to know every single person in the organization. And it's not that big, but very often in normal roles, we sit with people that we know, or we get to know people in our tasting groups or something like that. You don't really get to know everyone else. So that was so rewarding, and it was really fun. It's, on the surface, that's something I was thinking about with this conversation today about the educational side and the learning side of the Oregon Wine Brotherhood. Because I think that at our heart, we're an educational organization. When we talk to new candidates, every year we do something called the Commander's Coffee, where the new candidates come in and they get to meet the officer group, the cadres, and they get to hear about the history of the Oregon Wine Brotherhood, and then talk a little bit about themselves and why they wanted to join. And gosh, so often, so very often, the majority of the time, people say, well, I'm excited about the opportunity to learn more about wine. And it's a great organization for that, because at the heart of it is the wine tasting groups that get formed, and almost all the new members join a wine tasting group. Very often they don't know other people in it, so you get a chance to meet new people. But also, how many chances do we get to sit down at a table and have 6 different wines in front of us and compare them and taste them? And our group always does blind tastings, so it's a fun adventure to try to figure out where they're from or what they have in common. So there's a real learning component to that. The barrel tasting, of course, is a real learning component. You get to taste the wines out of the barrel, you get to compare them. And then so many of our members are part of the industry that gives you some insights into what it takes to make wine, what the ups and downs of the process are, what's involved, all that aspect of it. And I think also that it's interesting to think about the fact that our core, our DNA, comes from the wine brotherhoods of Europe. And they go back so very far. And they, at their heart, were really educational groups as well, because they were formed to promote the wines of their areas, very often very tiny little regions. But part of that promotional process is to expose those wines to people and help them learn more about it. And that was when you do the international event. If you go on one of the now every other year, there's a big event of all the brotherhoods that gather somewhere in the world, very often in Europe. But you really get into the countryside there and the people that make the wine and hear the stories of how their history and how they promote their wines. So it's another part of it that really is education. It's about learning about wine, and that's just, I think, exciting and fun.
Can you talk a little bit more about the history of the Oregon Wine Brotherhood?
Well, I'm not the best one to do all the details. I can give you a little broad history. It started when one of our founding member, John Bowers, was in California at one of the wine brotherhoods down there, the Knights of the Vine. And he had friends down there and was invited to come down to their assemblage, their big annual event, and got interested in forming a group here in Oregon. And that's what really started it. And it was a very small group of people, maybe 4 or 5 friends of John, who started the chapter, the Oregon chapter of the Knights of the Vine. And then in, I think it was 96 or 97, it was just after I joined, the Oregon chapter decided that we would separate from the California group and be a direct link, have a direct association with the group in Europe, the FICB, Fédération Internationale Confrérie Barrique. It's French for this wine brotherhood there that covers groups all over the world. So that's been really great to have that direct relationship. And we now have members that are on the board of the FICB and are very active. So we've got a really great connection there. And it makes it really fun to be able to go to Europe, to go to the museum of the FICB in Paris, to participate in all these international events. It adds another aspect to what makes it a fun organization, but also an educational organization.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit, so you talk about how the Oregon Wine Brotherhood likes to focus on that wine education. How did that become a focus for the scholarships that you guys do, doing wine education for younger people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the scholarship program existed, you'll have to talk to one of the other commanders about when it actually started. It was pretty small at first. And then, of course, as commander, I was on the scholarship committee where we would look at the applications from the students and stuff like that. And it continued to grow and grow, and now it's a pretty good endowment for education. But it like I said, education is part of our DNA, so of course it was important to support the people that are learning to be winemakers, learning to participate in the industry in one way or another, either through being sommeliers, who educate people about wine in a restaurant even, or through the winemaking programs. And so we've expanded to so many different colleges now and changed the program so that not just that aspect is there, but to directly fund projects that support the wine industry. So it's a natural fit. And one of the things that I think is kind of fun about it, at the Commander's Coffee every year when we talk about the new members coming in and we talk about the scholarship program, I've always felt that, I say in fun, that this is guaranteeing that we will have good wine to drink as we get older and we and other people are moving into the industry. It's a self-interest kind of thing, but it really is so much more than that, and it's really well supported by the membership, which I think is fantastic.
Can you talk a little bit about Linfield's Wine Studies program, particular, and what you think of that?
Well, it's a new thing for the Wine Brotherhood, and I think it's great to have this program now so close in the middll of the Willamette Valley. So we're not looking at UC Davis or other places far from here. We're right here in the middle of the Oregon wine country. So it's really special in that regard. And I'm really happy that we've got a close relationship now with the program here, because gosh, there's wonderful opportunities for our members to learn more about it, to get involved in various ways. It's fantastic.
And then what has the Oregon Wine, can you talk about some of the accomplishments of the Oregon Wine Brotherhood and what you see the organization doing in the future?
Well, I haven't thought about that a lot now that I'm not commander, since it's been quite a few years since I was. We've talked a lot about, do we want to expand and have chapters of the Oregon Wine Brotherhood like the California group does? And that topic comes up now and then, but I think that we really want to, it's a volunteer organization. So focusing our talent and the time and efforts of the membership here and to develop this group, I think, is something that is pretty valuable. Because it's a fantastic group. It's both from a social and a professional standpoint, it's one of the best groups I've ever been involved with. And the people stay because wine brings people together in such a beautiful way. And we make friends that we have for life. There's some funny stories about the wine groups. Originally, when they were formed, the wine tasting groups, the idea was that every year the groups would get reformed. So you'd have an opportunity to spend time with other members of the Wine Brotherhood. So our group was one of the very first ones, and none of us knew each other. And after the first year, where he said, well, you can't split us up. We want to stay at our group. And almost every group felt the same way. So that was 20 years ago. And the friends that we made over wine and food are now dear friends who we'll have for life, because wine brings people together. Wine and food brings people together and creates human relationships that are really wonderful and valuable. So that doesn't answer your question about where is the Oregon Wine Brotherhood going, but I don't know. I really don't know what I would see as that vision, except for keeping it vibrant and keeping it as involved in the industry and in people as possible, because I think it's an organization that does a lot of good, both from the mission of it in terms of the promotion and education of Oregon and Southwest Washington wines, but also what it does for people's lives. It's really valuable, and I'm so glad it continues to be vibrant and fun and the force that it is.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have anything else that you want to talk about? A question I should have asked that I didn't?
I don't think so. As I thought about it, I was really caught that I hadn't thought about it that much before, about that connection between the origins in Europe and the movement through to California and here in Oregon, and that tie to wine and learning about wine and the role that wine plays in life. It's not just a beverage that people sit down and drink like a cup of coffee. It really is something that changes people's lives and enhances people's lives in a really positive way. And I'm really glad about that. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Do you have anything? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview with us. We are here with Paul Hart. My name is Stephanie Hoffman, and we are talking about the Oregon Wine Brotherhood. It is July 17th, 2017, and we're at Nicholson Library. So at first, before we go into the Brotherhood, can you just talk a little bit about your personal background and career?
I started out as an actuary and worked for 25 years working with retirement plans and insurance companies, and got bored. So I started a winery called Rex Hill and did that for 25 years and retired finally. So now after my second career, I'm enjoying life. I've always enjoyed life, but I'm enjoying it even more. So.
So how did you develop an interest in wine?
I was exposed to some fantastic French Burgundies back in the 60s by friends of mine who had lived in Burgundy after the Second World War. There were some great vintages in the late 50s, early 60s. And what I didn't realize at the time was that I was really starting at the top, and that the wines that I was drinking were as good as they get. And then in the early 70s, I tasted one of the first Oregon Chardonnays and was absolutely shocked at the quality. It was so different from the other wines that were coming out of the United States, mostly from California. And it reminded me so much of the Burgundies. I immediately went out and started talking to people who were getting started, like David Lett and David Adelsheim, and became friends of theirs and good customers for a while till I started my own winery. So.
And then can you just talk a little bit about what is special about the Oregon wine industry?
The place, and that's what makes it what it is it's just an incredibly good place to grow some kinds of grapes. Pinot Noir especially, Pinot Gris, some Chardonnays, and a few others, but those are primarily what we call the cool climate grapes that suit the climate here.
Yes. So how did you first find out about the Oregon Wine Brotherhood?
I started buying grapes from a vineyard in the Dundee Hills called the Dundee Hills Vineyard, which was started by John Bowers in 1983. And John had founded the Oregon Wine Brotherhood several years before that. And he invited me to join as a member, and I came in very soon. And actually, within a year, I was very active in the organization. So.
Can you talk about the early years of being in the Oregon Wine Brotherhood? What was that like?
It was very special because everybody was so enthusiastic about wines, especially about Oregon wines. There were a number of people who were winemakers, winery owners, vineyard owners like John. And then there were a lot of people who were just good consumers who loved wine and liked to be around people from the industry and drink wine and eat good food. And fairly early on, we started doing some things for the community, giving back to the industry, and then started a scholarship program, which has become very, very successful, and I'm pleased with the results of that program. And the last couple of years, we've been doing quite a bit with Linfield and Linfield students through the scholarship programs.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the focus on wine education? How did that come about?
It really happened because those of us who were in the industry realized that we needed to have trained people coming along to fill a lot of jobs in the industry. And although the other schools around the world are really good, they don't necessarily teach people how to make wine or how to grow grapes in Oregon. And we thought it was important to be able to have that focus locally. And as more and more students became interested, it was really easy to find enthusiastic people to support it. So.
What do you think about Oregon's wine studies program, since it's a little bit different, where it doesn't focus on winemaking or growing the grapes?
It's quite a unique program. I'm really intrigued with it. And one of the things that is the most astonishing maybe to me is to think back to the early days of the industry, especially when we started the International Pinot Noir celebration here on the Linfield campus. And at that time, there were quite a few of your board members who were not at all happy about having a bunch of drunk Pinot drinkers on the campus. And to see the school move in the direction of establishing a program that's promoting wine is wonderful.
Why did you choose to join? You talked about John introduced it to you, but why did you choose to actually join the Oregon Wine Brotherhood?
I liked the tradition, the history, and the feeling of camaraderie, being part of something that was connected to the industry but not totally part of the industry. And I'm sure that other people, including Ron, have probably talked a lot about the brotherhoods and the hundreds and hundreds of years of history behind the wine brotherhoods in Europe especially, where each little community and each little region has its own group with its own traditions and their own medallions and hats and robes and all the paraphernalia that goes with being part of a historical organization like that. That's why I enjoyed being part of it.
And then can you talk about the positions you held in the Oregon Wine Brotherhood and what you did with those? You don't do all of them, the big ones.
I don't know that I can remember all of them, but I started out on the what's called the cadre, which is the group of officers that leads the organization. And I can't even remember what my first title was, but I was very active, and I got involved with our programs, especially the, we call our induction programs, where we bring in new members, and then became the assistant commander and ultimately the grand commander of the organization, and was the leader for several years until I found a successor, and now probably the last decade, I've been the master of ceremonies and been responsible for doing a lot of the writing of the programs.
Now, can you talk about your time of being Grand Commander and what that was like and what that position entailed?
I was fortunate because I had a very good group of cadre of other officers and was able to assign responsibilities to everybody. So I had people who made sure that things got done, and I just kind of was the leader and tried to stay out of the way. It was fun. And trying to figure out what future of the organization was we had a very an interesting time, because when it started out, it was part of a group called the Knights of the Vine, which was affiliated with the Fédération Internationale Bachique in Paris. And we were part of that group for a long time. And there were some changes within that group, and we weren't as enthusiastic about the way they were headed. So we decided that we were mature enough and we had enough people in the organization who were enthusiastic and willing to work that we could form our own group, which we did ultimately, and are affiliated directly with the Fédération and are a separate group from the Knights of the Vine here, although we're affiliated with the same international organizations. That was really a very, very busy time, because in order to get our affiliation with the Fédération, we had to design our own costumes, design our medallions, our hats, and submit all of that to them and have them approve those. So we were going to be worthy of being an organization that was part of that group. And they did approve it. And
Well, that's good.
we got off on our own. But it was definitely a very, very busy time that involved a lot of people. So.
So what are you proud of that the Oregon Wine Brotherhood has accomplished before you came in and during your time in it?
I'm very proud of the scholarship program, especially proud of that. It's been just so successful and has really helped a lot of students along the way. I'm proud of some of the things that we've done as a group. We hosted the international, it's an international meeting that happens every 2 years or so that involves representatives from brotherhoods from all over the world. And we hosted them here in Portland. And it was about a 3-year project getting prepared for that, and very, very successful. And my wife and I have attended probably a dozen of the internationals all over the world, and they still tell us that the one they had in Portland was one of the best ever. So that was fun, and I'm very proud of being able to do that. And I'm proud of being able to represent our group at these international events. One of them was held in Austria, and we had I'll back up a little bit. It's at the international meeting. They usually have one morning where they have a mass in a Catholic church, and everybody puts on their robes and hats and their medallions and marches down through whatever the town is to the church. And in Austria, we were in a small town which had been the ancestral home of the Esterhazy family, and this wonderful cathedral that was the location for our program. And the day before, the man who ran our international group came to me and he said, would I be willing to get up after the Mass, after the ceremony, and give a few words on behalf of the New World, and then they would have somebody else from Europe have a few words about the Old World. So I had a little bit of German and a little bit of French along the way, and I decided that I could write a very small introductory thing and try to say it in both German and French and English. And I did, and I started out in German and then French and then English. And by the time I was through, there were a lot of people in tears. They just said, this is the first time that one of the Americans has ever stood up and tried to say anything in any language but English.
Oh, wow.
So they were all coming up to me wanting to talk to me in German and talk to me in French. And I said, wait a minute. I said, it's been a long time. I can write a little speech and I can give it so you can understand it, but I can't understand when you're talking so fast and converse with you. Anyway, it was a wonderful experience, and I think partly as a result of that, we've made a lot of very good friends out of that group over the years. People we love to see when we attend another internationals.
So what do you see, or what do you hope the Oregon Wine Brotherhood accomplishes in the future? What is the future of the organization?
Well, I'd certainly like to see it continue to represent the industry. And over the years, we have done some very special ceremonies for certain things. When the Chemeketa Community College opened their wine school in Salem, we wrote a little ceremony and went down in all of our robes and regalia and our swords and presented this ceremony to kind of to inaugurate the place. And we've done that for a number of other places, including the Evergreen Museum when they opened there, and that's been kind of special. And I'd like to see us do more of that, because there's just not enough ceremony anymore around opening of things and special events. So anyway, I hope we'll do more of that.
And then can you just talk a little bit about all the different pieces that you wear for the Oregon Wine Brotherhood? You were talking about how you had to design your medals and your hats. Can you talk about what all goes into that?
Sure. Actually, my wife, who is an artist, was asked by our group to be the designer of the things. So she designed the medallion, which has a wine glass, it has fir trees, it has raindrops, it has our slogan, it has some grapes, and it's very representative of our group. And the officers have a gold medallion and the other members have a silver medallion, and then there are different types of ribbons depending upon your office and your responsibilities in the group. And then on my, I have medallions from a number of other regions around the world where we have attended international events, and I've joined their brotherhoods when I've been at those international events. So I've got medallions representing almost all of them that we visited, and that's been fun. So our robes are a burgundy, about the color of this burgundy, and they're a wool, a very light wool, so they're easy to pack. They're relatively heavy, but it's a light fabric, and we can pack them and they don't get too wrinkled, and they're fairly comfortable. The ones that we used to wear with the Knights of the Vine were made out of some kind of a green acetate material that didn't breathe at all. And they were okay indoors, but man, if you were out in the sunshine, those things would get hot. Anyway, so ours are very comfortable. And then we've got hats that, I should have brought my hat. So it's kind of a big floppy burgundy and black hat with gold braid on it, feather on the side.
Well, that's all I have for you.
Okay.
Do you have anything else that you want
Not
to
really.
talk about?
It's just a very special organization, and we try to keep the number of members around 150 so we can have our special events in a place like the Allison and have special occasions with them. If we get much over 150, we can't find a place that has room that can provide the service and the quality of food that we like to have. So, and the quality of wines. Anyway, that's it.
My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with founding Grand Commander Emeritus of the Oregon Wine Brotherhood, Paul de Boni. It is July 21st, 2017, and we're in the Nicholson Library on Linfield's campus. And Paul, we're going to start you off by, before we talk about wine, a little bit about your own background and career.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, So I was exposed to wine at a very early age, coming from an Italian family. My grandparents would buy grapes for the neighborhood and then produce wine for everyone. And it was terrible wine, but they loved to do it, and we loved participating in it. And so my interest in wine, I don't even remember where it started, would have gone way back. I know my parents were upset with my grandparents for getting me drunk when I was 6 years old. But I've enjoyed wine ever since. Back in the 70s, I started to realize that the Oregon wine industry was really starting to become something special. And at that point, I don't think a lot of people really understood, what was going on with it. But we started following it, and so my wife and I started buying wines and started meeting more and more people in the wine industry. We got to know some of the original pioneers of the industry personally, and there were just a handful of them at that point, not very many at all. My background, though, I went to Portland State University and a degree in political science, urban studies, and I was a planner, public planner for quite a few years in Medford, director of community development down there. I was city administrator in Tumwater, planner in Gresham, and then Multnomah County, was land development manager, and then went over to Clark County in Vancouver, where I was developer of planning services for Clark Regional Planning Council. Did a lot of consulting, and I actually ended up doing some consulting work helping some of the wineries with some of their land use issues. Back then I was involved with Senate Bill 100, knew Tom McCall as a personal friend, so was really into the land use components that deal with wineries and wine, and so I spent quite a bit of time in that. And from there I did a lot of, from consulting work, I started doing some development work of my own, and so I've developed a number of communities, and that's currently what I'm doing, is developing some residential communities in the metropolitan area and around it. So that's kind of my background.
So you mentioned kind of realizing in the 1970s that Oregon wine was becoming something. Do you remember a particular moment or a particular bottle or something that kind of triggered, like, this could be something?
Well, I think it was talking to Dick Ponzi was probably where it really started to take off. And when my wife and I would go over to the Ponzi's every Thursday night for years, and I talked to Dick about things that he was trying, with wines, and at that time, we thought the wines were pretty good. They weren't great, but we liked the people so much and what they were doing and the direction of it and the culture that was involved in wine and wine production, that we just kind of became fans of the Oregon wine industry. Being fans, we talked about the problems that they had, and I know that like Dick would go to Italy and he'd come back and he'd try some strange technique that he learned there. One year he boiled the must, and just to see how that worked out. And I think it was 1980 vintage, which turned out to be awful. But then years later, he and I tried some of it, and it wasn't bad at all. But then I think the Oregon Pinot Noir is really, at that time there was a lot of Riesling being grown, and not a lot of Pinot Noir, and they were experimenting. They were trying the scientific approach, the way it came out of Davis, and I think a lot of them were starting to learn that it's as much art as it is science, and everyone was doing something a little differently, and I think they're all trying to find out what the Oregon style was, but really what it was the collection of the different people that were in the industry who were just trying to do different things and to find a way. But back then, I think it was just probably one of the first bottles of Dick's wines that I had back about 1980, 81, that really started to get my interest going.
So you talked a little bit about this in that answer, but I'm wondering if you can be, what is, see, the people are special in the industry. What else is special about the Oregon wine industry?
Well, I think what's special about it is that wine itself, it brings people together. It's a very cultural kind of a product, not like other kinds of food or drink, and it brings people together. It has historically through the ages as well. So it's a different kind of a product, and we thought that back then, I think, and realized that it isn't just, like growing corn or something else. It's something that brings people together, both in the industry, the consumers. It's part of celebrations. It's part of people's lives. It's a food, but it's more than that.
So you also talked a little bit about the land use planning and your involvement in that, and it's one of the more interesting stories, I think, of the early days of the industry is kind of the foresight to protect the land. So talk about your involvement in that and how early the industry knew that it had to work on that as a project.
Well, I think, like I say, my experience goes back to about 1973 with the Senate Bill 100 that created the land use laws. And an integral component of that was the exclusive farm use zoning. For the first time, an effort to really preserve agricultural land in large blocks and prevent it from being converted to non-agricultural use. But part of the problem with that is that protectionism was intended to protect against historic kinds of large acreage products, and not something that can be as simple as a boutique winery and vineyard. And so I think it was probably back in the early 90s when we first started to talk about the fact that there had to be some special provisions in the land use laws to allow for boutique wineries to locate in these exclusive farm use areas where otherwise they wouldn't have been allowed under state law. So I worked with some of the wineries and the wine board people and helped, I think, with some of the work that went into producing some changes to the law that provided for these facilities.
So let's talk about the Wine Brotherhood a little bit. How did you become aware of it, or that it existed? Well,
this goes back to about, I guess, 1984, when I first heard about the International Brotherhood of the Knights of the Vine, which was a chapter of an international organization out of Sacramento. And I think Paul Hart was the one who first talked to him about it. He had just joined, and he thought I might be interested in it. And the more I looked into it, the more I was. So I got into the organization, loved the people. Some of my best friends have come out of that organization. We loved the events, we loved the festivities, we loved the culture, the history, the pageantry that went into that organization. And then at one point, we kind of came at cross purposes with the Sacramento group, who saw our chapters being financially the most successful, and there was some disheveled activity going on down there as well. They were in the process of changing management of that organization, and we just decided the direction they were going is not the direction we wanted to go. So in 1994, I went to the annual business meeting of the Knights of the Vine, and at that point, I withdrew Oregon chapter from that organization, met with the president of FCIB, and as long as some other people like Dwayne Young, who's a lieutenant general and doctor who was an integral member of that organization. He and I kind of got together and we talked about how we could set up a chapter of our own. And at that point I learned that the Knights of the Vine had these chapters all over the United States, but they were all part of this one organization that had a charter with France. And I found out that we could get a charter directly from France and separate from that organization. So we made that decision, and then immediately when I came back and we started to organize, I received some letters basically saying, you can't use any of the paraphernalia, any of the information, names, anything of the Knights of the Vine, because that's a California corporation. All those things are protected, and you'll get sued. So we spent months just creating the medallion, the design for the emblem, the costumes, the colors, picking out materials. My wife and Jan Jacobson spent a lot of time working on putting those together. It took quite a while. We finally got it together, and we had an assemblage where at one point I inducted the entire membership, which was about 150, in one evening into the new organization that was the Brotherhood of the Knights of the Vine. So one of the things about the Brotherhood is that it's a conglomeration of winemakers, people who are in the retail business and winemaking, anything that has to do with the wine industry, along with a lot of people who just care about those things, care about those people, care about what they're doing. And so we became kind of the rally squad for the Oregon wine industry early on. We wanted to see it grow and thrive, and at that point it really didn't have a large showing nationally and internationally. And so we simply kept trying to encourage that kind of activity. And then in 2001, I managed to talk the president of the Federation into allowing us to host an international congress in Portland. So we had members from the wine industries from 17 different countries that came here and stayed in Portland and paraded down Main Street and full regalia and were exposed to the Oregon wine industry and simply amazed. And at that point, our wines had become much more popular, much more in demand internationally. And I remember a number of those winemakers from some of the small, obscure parts of France wanting to know, how do you get this kind of money for your bottle of wine? You know, what do we have to do it? And I said, well, you've got a long road to haul, and we've been doing it for a long time now.
So as you were creating this new organization, or even just when you're part of the Knights of the Vine, how did you go about setting up what the mission of the organization would be?
Well, the mission, the whole concept of knights, you may have heard, it goes back to the medieval days when the preferred way of regime change was through poisoning. So the knights originally were the protectors of the vineyard, protectors of the wine. So that whole idea of knighthood, which flourished in France for many years, and then with the revolution, it was all taken away. Then back in the 50s, it was reconstituted, and the whole idea of knights was brought back into the culture. And the whole concept of the history, pageantry, and kinship, and working together, comradeship, all of those concepts became more and more important, and they're an integral part of being a knight, so to speak, or a brotherhood. So the term brotherhood has, I think, special connotations that have more to do with kinship and friendship and camaraderie than just a social club. You know, so that's, I think, the elements that we thought were important to instill into the organization. So pageantry and the history, the decorations, the celebration of wine and celebration of comradeship were really the main elements that we were looking for in the organization.
And now you have a focus on philanthropy and as well as education. So can you talk about how that's kind of evolved?
Sure. In those early years, I think we understood that there was almost no education related to wine, especially in Oregon. Everyone had come out of University of California at Davis if they had any education at all in wines. And we realized that there simply needed to be something more localized. So early on, we got together with the Western Culinary Institute, and we started a scholarship program. And I remember we had these events where we'd invite a number of students to serve wine. So we'd have them pair up wine with food from the Culinary Institute, and then explain to us why they did it, and why they did the pairings. And as a result, we started giving out scholarships. Back then, there were a few, $500 here, $1,000 there, not much. But that program grew and grew. And then over the years, we started realizing that there's more interest in wine education. And we participated in Schmitt setting up their program. And in fact, Oregon Wine Brotherhood has a room there that we donated. We did quite a few scholarships through that program as well. And then that's expanded to today. We have a full-time program that provides scholarships for a number of different universities.
What are you proudest of in terms of accomplishments by the Wine Brotherhood since you've been a part of it?
I think one of the most prideful thing I did, I think, was getting that international congress to Portland. It was unheard of. At that point, half the people in the organization internationally didn't even know where Oregon was or what Portland was. And it took a lot of doing to convince those people in Europe not only to allow us to put on the program, but also to convince them that they should actually come to the event. In fact, one of the experiences I recall is I was told when we were in France in 2000, they told me that, well, you're going to have to invite these French people to come to Oregon next year, and you're going to have to do it personally because they don't even know where it is. So I said, okay. So they said, you're going to have to make a speech. And I said, okay. And they said, you're going to have to do it in French. And I said, I don't speak a word of French. So I had someone put together a translation for me in French so that I could read it. And I was sitting next to Nancy Ponzi at the time. She looked at it, she grabbed it away from me. And she says, you're never going to be able to read this. So she rewrote it in phonetic French. So I walked into this room, and here's a couple of hundred people from different countries, mostly French, all sitting there with their earphones on, ready to listen to this translation from English into French. And I read this thing, and they're shaking their heads and taking off the earbuds, putting them down. And then at the end, they all got up and clapped. And I went down to the president. I said, did they understand that? And he said, they understood every word, and they are so impressed that you would go to that much trouble that he says, I think you'll get good participation.
What do you hope the Wine Brotherhood will do in the future? What do you hope the future looks like? Well,
I think the importance of the heritage, and kind of my wife and I have kind of taken over the role of historians for the organization, partly because we don't want to see it divert from some of the original goals of pageantry and history, celebration. We want to make sure that old world element continues on even into the 21st and 22nd centuries. It's just something we don't want to see lost. Because it's pretty easy to talk about the commercial end of any kind of business like winemaking, and it's become a huge business. And I just don't want to see it lose that intimacy and history and pageantry that we've brought it to date.
What about the future of the Oregon wine industry? What do you think it looks like, or what do you hope it looks like?
Well, what I hope it looks like is that we continue to celebrate boutique wineries and the smallness that we've had, so that there can be successes in experimentation, successes in small businesses, trying different things, functioning in different ways. It's obviously moving more towards a large-scale business and industry nowadays, and I think that's healthy. But on the other hand, I'd hate to see it lose that smallness and intimacy of the small winemaker.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you'd like to mention? Anything else I forgot to ask?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, then thank you very much.
Sure.
We appreciate your time. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here at Nicholson Library at Linfield College with Pat and Joe Campbell from Elko Vineyards. It's August 3rd, 2017. And we're going to start by asking, just before we talk about the Brotherhood, we're going to talk a little bit about your own background and career. So we have your story before, but if you can give us kind of the short synopsis of your wine industry experience, that'd be great.
Well, Joe and I planted our first 10 acres of grapes in 1974 and made wine in 1977, from our first crop of grapes. And then in 1981, we were able to build a new winery. Before that, we were making wine in a remodeled barn. And so then we kept planting grapes until we had planted pretty much all of the land that we owned there. And then a few years later, we were able to buy 24 acres next to us. And that became the Lobawem Vineyard, which is quite a well-known vineyard for us. And then we expanded our winery in 1996. We also expanded our vineyard holdings by adding the Mount Richmond Vineyard in 96. And then we bought the property across the road from there, and we call that Mount Richmond East. And that really brought our property holdings and our vineyard expansion up quite a lot. In the meantime, of course, we were trying to sell all our wine and market our wine, and Joe and I both worked on that.
Mm-hmm. And Rich, my background was in medicine. So I was working really full-time as an emergency room physician. Because of that, I could work 24-hour shifts. I'd come home, get on the tractor, do vineyard work, do winemaking work with Pat. So that was really a very cooperative partnership. And I think, obviously, without the two of us, we never could have done it. I think over the years, the women in the industry have gotten far too little credit. And
I would agree with that.
yeah, and I think the ones where they were affected by divorce or some other catastrophe, they didn't end up very successful because of that.
And I know, and it's still in the family now because Adam is the winemaker now, your son, and I know your daughter Anna also works there. So I know it's still a big family business.
It is.
Absolutely.
And Adam has just done an incredible job.
That was probably one of the happiest days of our life when Adam decided that he wanted to come and work for us in the family business, and that was 1994, right after he graduated from Lewis and Clark. And so...
And we stepped away in 1999 and really just turned it over to Adam.
yeah,
It's a nice feeling to have.
it was great. It was great.
So back up a little bit and tell us about how you sort of first developed an interest in wine.
Pat.
Well,
Yeah.
we were living in the San Francisco Bay Area where Joe had gone to Stanford Medical School, and he also did his internship in San Francisco. And so that gave us a really nice opportunity to go up and visit the wineries in Napa and Sonoma. And we were lucky enough to one time be in on a tasting of first growth Burgundies, and that kind of like clinched it for us. Okay, this is good stuff. And then of course we started hearing about people in Oregon starting to plant Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and we just thought, that sounds good. And I always had an interest in farming since I grew up in an apple and pear farm, and so we just started looking for land, and luckily we found our beautiful spot there at Elk Cove.
And so when you got to Oregon, what was it that was special to you either then or now about the Oregon wine industry?
Well, I think we really looked around to see something we could plant, and we discovered that a few people were planting vineyards, and that just clicked, and we became very excited. Once we had grapes, we read everything we could about winemaking. Pat's background in farming and mine in chemistry. just seemed to fit.
And we made home wine for the first 2 years before we started making commercial wine, and we learned a lot there. We weren't able to get Oregon grapes, but we got some from Washington and experimented. It was really fun. Kids helped.
And I think we had a very early success, at least for me, was somewhat of a turning point. A few of the early winemakers got together to do a tasting of their Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays to serve at a dinner honoring Robert Drouhin from Burgundy. So this was a blind tasting of the early winemakers, and they selected both our Chardonnay and our Pinot Noir.
It was pretty exciting because the tasting was held at Oregon State, and Barney Watson ran the tasting. And so everything was above board, and they were pretty shocked when both of the wines came from Elk Cove, the top wine.
And that was a very early vintage.
Oh, yeah, it was 1978
Yeah,
Chardonnay and 1978 Pinot Noir.
So then we really decided that we were on the right track.
Maybe this whole thing could work out.
Yes.
So let's talk about the Wine Brotherhood a little bit. How did you first find out about the Oregon Wine Brotherhood?
Well, I found out from John Bowers. And he had gone to a dinner, I think 2 dinners, of the Knights of the Vine in San Francisco. So he came to me, it was myself,
Maybe Ron Hayes.
yeah, Ron Hayes, I'm blocking on his name, Cecil Chamberlain, and Fred Benoit. 4 of us met at our home in Portland and really talked about what we might do to start a brotherhood, similar to the one in San Francisco. And it was going to be connected to the one in San Francisco, and that worked out very briefly. And there were some politics which I was not involved in, but it was decided to form our own brotherhood, and that's the origin.
And I'd have to say I was very proud of Joe because he put his heart into it and was the master vintner for the Oregon Wine Brotherhood for, I don't know, at least 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so that meant that he was in charge of doing a special tasting at least once a year, and then other tastings throughout the year. And we had some really outstanding tastings, and I think that really got the Brotherhood excited about the Oregon wines. So it's been good, and I think that I forget what the saying is, something celebrating the wines and the vines of Oregon. It was always about Oregon. So, and of course that's the way other chapters are in other parts of the world. They're celebrating their region.
And that was really my attraction. And when I did these tastings, they were all blind, and I'd usually have a theme, and we would hold it at a restaurant, usually in Portland, and then we would unveil the wines, and people would see how well they did.
So when you set out to, since you were there at the very beginning planning stages, what was it that you guys were hoping to create? What was it about the Brotherhood that attracted you?
Well, John Bowers, of course, had Dundee Hills Vineyard, which has changed hands since
A couple times.
John is deceased, and the ex-governor Goldschmidt bought it from John, and now there's
Yes, well,
a third.
Winderley owns part of it, and the other half I'm not sure.
So really, John and Sally Bowers having a vineyard, and we being involved with vineyards and winery, it was a perfect fit since the idea that Pat mentioned to promote the wines of the region of Oregon was really what attracted me.
So, and now there's been sort of a focus on like wine education over the years, both on educating sort of consumers of wine and now sort of educating students who are going to work in wine. So how did that come to be a focus for the group?
I think it just evolved. And the group, I think prior maybe to supporting education, they created scholarships for wine students, viticulture students, and that was successful, and they expanded that program.
And I think originally the money from, they had an auction every year at a vineyard, and they moved it around from winery to winery. And so then the funds raised from that auction would go to support the scholarship programs. And
that's continuing.
yeah.
So what are the accomplishments of the Wine Brotherhood that you're most proud of?
I think really the scholarships and the education.
I'm proud that they started including women. Because when Joe first joined the Brotherhood, he was the member and I tagged along. And I didn't really want to become a gentle lady of the vine, which was the option at that time.
And I can attest, she's not gentle.
So then they decided to include another category for Master Lady of the Vine, and I thought, well, okay, I'll go for that.
Can you talk about anything that's any sort of memorable experiences, whether it's traveling together or a tasting event or something that you kind of fondly remember from the Brotherhood?
Well, I think holding the barrel tasting at our winery was very special.
We also held another tasting that I was pretty amazed by. We had a 10-year vertical of Elk Cove wines and Erath wines, and this was when Dick Erath was still involved at Erath Winery. At the end of the tasting, everyone decided that the 1987 vintage from both wineries were the top wines.
But that was a blind tasting.
It was all blind,
So-
10 years, 10 vintages. I mean, it was quite amazing because 1987, from the critics' point of view, really didn't get very good ratings. So,
And we had, do you remember the 10 years that were involved?
I think starting maybe 1979 through 1989, yeah.
Interesting.
So that was one of my favorite tastings that we held. And
Because it was a
we held it
huge-
at Elk Cove.
Just a huge surprise.
Yeah, because everyone thought, oh, 85, that's going to definitely get it.
Or 89.
Yeah.
So what about, are you still currently involved in the Brotherhood? Are you still...
I'm a member, but we really are not very active.
Okay. Is there anything that you'd like to see it do in the future? What would you like to see the Oregon Brotherhood look like in 5, 10, 15 years?
I don't see any changes.
I'd like to see them somehow attract a lot younger people and younger winemakers, a lot more women, a lot more gentle ladies.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention? Anything I should have asked that I didn't? Any last words about the Brotherhood?
I think you were thorough.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you, Rich.
thank you again for sitting down.